In the last video, I gave a very introductory description of phenomenology and briefly mentioned how phenomenology had introduced new topics into philosophy through the examination of what might seem like trivial phenomena. Phenomena like an apricot cocktail, the taste of a Madeleine in tea, or in the case of my video, a review of the Little Store brand of instant coffee. In this video, I would like to explore how we can get from the phenomena themselves to understanding phenomena, and from understanding to actions and practical responses. How we can structure this enterprise is what I will be calling practical philosophy or praxis. There are many ways to structure such work. The way I'll be presenting here is one I based on the work of Richard Osmer, a Princeton-based theologian who proposed structuring practical work in theology around a series of tasks and questions. I feel this same approach, a series of interrogative tasks, is also useful in philosophical work. Now, the structure I will be presenting here is not entirely the same as Osmer's work. I have added a question and altered some of the terminology, but what I'm presenting here is derivative of and mostly cognate with the work of Osmer. Nothing about this is really original to me, and there are certainly other valid ways to structure philosophical praxis. For example, I've included a hermeneutic task which is absent from Osmer, but the things I seek to uncover in the hermeneutic task are treated by Osmer elsewhere. All lists are essentially arbitrary, and this is basically a to-do list. To demonstrate how a philosophical inquiry can be structured towards a practical end, I will be making reference to the Four Noble Truths of Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha, who masterfully and succinctly deals with the phenomenon of suffering in a similarly structured way. Now, before we start, I want to say that not every philosophical question is necessarily immediately practical. Sometimes a question is worth answering because it is inherently interesting. Sometimes it takes a while for an answered question to find practical applications. A phenomenon might be worth looking at out of simple curiosity. That's totally fine with me. We could all stand to have a more curious attitude towards the world, just simply wanting to know. Now, to present the 5 tasks and their questions. 1. The phenomenological task. What is this? What is happening? 2. The hermeneutic task. What is the meaning of this? 3. The critical task. Why is this happening? Where did this come from? 4. The normative task. What should be happening? What should be the case? How should this situation really be? 5. The pragmatic task. How can we respond? What can we do about it? The first task is what I call the phenomenological task, which corresponds to Osmer's descriptive empirical task. The task here is to ask what's going on, or what is this phenomenon? Here, we want to gather information and data about whatever phenomenon is being discussed. A situation, a practice, an experience, whatever. This could involve observation, interviewing, research. For now, other questions are set aside, and our biases are to be set aside too. This is an important part of the phenomenological process that Husserl referred to as bracketing, which means looking at the phenomenon without judgment, setting aside bias, setting aside assumptions, focusing on the experience itself. Let's think about ghosts, for example, since that's going to be one of the topics on the Accidental Phenomenologist Podcast a few months from now. Our goal isn't to objectively verify a ghost story or to try to uncover the truth about the literal existence of ghosts or disproving the existence of ghosts. Someone says they saw a ghost. That qualifies as an experience. A ghost is a phenomenon. The question of the real existence of the ghost, or what the ghost really is, a spirit from another world, an apparition, a hallucination, a dream, all of that is set aside. What we want is to see the thing itself as it was experienced and how the experiencer interacts with the phenomenon. Different phenomenologists had different ideas of what was to be included here. Husserl was interested in trying to uncover what was essential to the phenomenon without anything external to it. Sartre and Heidegger, however, pointed out that experiences don't happen in a vacuum. They have a setting. Phenomena and experiencers of phenomena are situated in a context. This situation may contain recurring patterns and trends. There's a cultural background, beliefs, and expectations that might be relevant. There's much more that could be said, but the basic point is the identification and comprehensive description of a phenomenon to be investigated or discussed. In journalistic terms, who, what, when, where. Questions like how and why will come up later. The first noble truth of the Buddha is phenomenological. Suffering exists. Suffering is a fact of existence, and it is an experience universally had by sentient beings. Put another way, suffering exists, and the consciousness of a sentient being isn't just registering the sensation of suffering. The consciousness is directed towards the experience of suffering itself. This is what phenomenology calls the intentionality of consciousness, and this intentionality is what gives the experience its meaning and emotional weight. The second task is what I call the hermeneutic task, using the term used by Heidegger and Hans-Georg Gadamer. The hermeneutic task asks, what does this phenomenon mean? The existentialists identified meaning as a fundamental drive for humans. We want our experiences to mean something, and we get frustrated when the things that happen seem meaningless and senseless. Ultimately, hermeneutics is about meaning. The goal here is to go from simple observation and description of what is happening to a deeper understanding that allows for more informed inquiry and a more informed response as we continue. Hermeneutics helps us to make sense of complex information and situations. American philosopher Rick Roderick explained hermeneutics in this way. Hermeneutics provides us with a story, a narrative. Heidegger's Being and Time provided us with a narrative about the relationship between human being with the world. Roderick said, now the nice thing about a story as opposed to a method is that you don't approach them the same way. If a story is powerful, interesting, and it grabs you and you can find meaning in it, it's not the best question to ask about the narrative, is it true or false? To return to the example of ghosts, I was born and raised in a city with a long tradition of ghost stories, many of which bear witness to historical traumas of the past. And they are compelling stories that have meaning for the people who tell them. The hermeneutic task here is to understand what an experience means to the people who have lived it. In this case, the people who have encountered a phenomenon they perceive to be or suspect to be a ghost. Further, most people who have had such an experience have been affected by it in some way. It changed their fundamental beliefs about the world. Maybe it was a traumatic experience for them. It's also possible that an experience had a positive, transformative effect on a person. I want to understand what the experience meant to the person who lived it and how it affected them. Though the hermeneutic task is not explicitly covered by the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha did make statements that would fall into this category, and one could find hermeneutic assumptions in the First Noble Truth and the Second Noble Truth. And while Osmer's model doesn't have an explicitly hermeneutic step, hermeneutic considerations are discussed elsewhere in his framework. I've separated it out of a desire to emphasize the importance of meaning to lived human experience. The third task, what I call the critical task, asks, why is this going on, or where does this come from? And asking this question is what we call critique. Now, in everyday speech, we might think of critique and being critical as negative things. Someone might think offering a critical inquiry about this or that thing intends to prove it false or even ethically wrong. French philosopher Paul Ricoeur used the term suspicion, another word that generally makes people uneasy, but he meant that for any given phenomenon, it was reasonable to suspect that there were motivations, dynamics, and forces at work that weren't necessarily immediately known. So here, by critique, I mean the practice of discovering and describing the origins and internal mechanisms of something without necessarily making a value judgment. The simplest way to perform critique is to just ask the question, where does this come from? It involves analyzing the origin of a phenomenon and the factors that contribute to the situation and its development. That's all. The second noble truth of the Buddha is critical. The origin of suffering is in desire, the desire for gratification, the desire to avoid pain, the desire to have more than we currently have, and the desire to avoid losing what we do have, the desire especially to cling to things that are impermanent, like youth and beauty and life itself. The Buddha isn't saying these things are necessarily bad. He was merely making a point about how suffering arises from our attachments to what we have, or what we wish we had, and our fear of losing them. The fourth task is the normative task. The question asked here is axiological. Axiology is concerned with values and ideals. What ought to be going on? What ought to be the case? This is where ethical questions would be asked, but other axiological questions could be asked, for example, that of well-being and health. When Abraham Maslow proposed the hierarchy of needs, it was descriptive of how he believed human actualization to work. It implies a normative framework for human well-being towards self-actualization. When something on the pyramid was missing, the individual couldn't self-actualize, and self-actualization was what Maslow believed should be happening. Self-actualization is how human beings become physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, existentially healthy. Failure to do so is unhealthy. The third noble truth of the Buddha arguably fits in here, in that by telling us there is a way to end suffering, one can see that suffering need not be the norm. Finally, like Osmer, I call the final task the pragmatic task, where we ask, how might we respond? With the pragmatic task, we want to understand our options for response and propose actions consistent with the values on which we decided in our normative task. Now, however you feel about Marxism or anything that has been done in the name of Karl Marx, there is a quote of his that I find meaningful, and that is the 11th of his Theses on Feuerbach. Philosophers have merely interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Now, given the phenomenon under consideration, our call to action might not be so dramatic. But to return to my example of the Four Noble Truths of the Buddha has identified and described a phenomenon, suffering, and his fourth truth has identified and recommended a course of action. For the Buddha, the response to suffering is to adopt a new framework for thinking and living, which he called the Eightfold Path. 8 interconnected practices that begin by developing a healthy and honest view of reality, cultivating the mental attitudes and awareness necessary for sustaining this path, and living according to ethical values which ameliorate suffering on a broad plane, not merely ending my own suffering, but alleviating that of other beings. With the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha had not only identified a phenomenon and acknowledged its impact, he geared his disciples towards action and response. Rather than just studying abstract ideas or even concrete things, a framework such as that conceived by Osmer helps translate the things we learn into praxis that is guided by the mission, vision, and values we have. It helps to answer the questions, so what? What now? Praxis comprehends that understanding the world, theory, can and should bear upon how we actually live in the world or even change the world. How we live in the world not only shapes the world, it defines ourselves in the process. I also think there's a concept in product and business design that is interesting as we contemplate how to practice philosophy, namely the concept of iteration. When a design is initially conceived, it's given to stakeholders and users who then provide feedback from which new iterations, hopefully improved iterations, arise. This cycle continues until all stakeholders are satisfied with the result. Praxis, however you choose to frame it, can be thought of as an iterative process. We should consider refining our conclusions by repeating the process. Continue asking questions. Continue seeking interpretation. Continue refining our values. Continue looking for more optimal responses. Before I say goodbye, I had promised in the last video that the next one would be about anxiety, but I kind of wanted to introduce some of the concepts of practical philosophy first, because I'll be discussing how philosophers like Kierkegaard and Heidegger diagnosed anxiety as part of the human condition and what it means to be human. And I'll also discuss anxiety as an imminent lived experience before offering some considerations for not merely managing but transforming our anxiety, including some practical suggestions from philosophers and psychologists that I have found helpful myself and which I passed on to my clients when I did one-on-one coaching and pastoral care in Asia. That's coming up next, I swear. So if that's something that might help you, please subscribe and hit the bell so you'll be notified when that video comes out. Until then, thank you for joining me for the second video. While I would love it if you liked and subscribed and offered supportive or helpful comments, more than anything, I appreciate you just being here and hearing what I have to say. I wish you peace.